The most expensive word Charles Whitmore ever spoke wasn't worth $3.5 billion. It was worth exactly the opposite. "Don't touch me, you stupid black girl." The sentence cracked through the grand ballroom like a dropped glass in a cathedral. Conversation stopped. Silverware hovered in midair. Even the soft jazz drifting from the corner stage seemed to lose its rhythm for a heartbeat. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the center of the room, toward the billionaire, toward the waitress, toward the moment nobody would forget. Charles Whitmore stood beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most American homes. At 39 years old, he was the celebrated founder and CEO of Whitmore Technologies, a company valued at nearly $12 billion. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly. His smile usually controlled rooms. Investors admired him. Reporters chased him. Competitors feared him. Tonight was supposed to be another victory, a historic acquisition, a $3.5 billion deal that would place his company at the top of the industry. Everything had been planned down to the minute. Everything except Naomi Brooks. Naomi stood motionless beside the table, a white linen cloth still folded neatly in her hands. Her black server uniform was immaculate. Her posture remained straight. Her expression remained calm. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even blink. That silence confused people. Most expected anger. Some expected tears. Others expected an apology. Instead, Naomi simply stood there, looking at Charles with a composure that felt strangely out of place. Like she knew something nobody else knew. Like she was watching a storm arrive before anyone else saw the clouds. Around them, the ballroom shimmered with wealth. Golden lights reflected across polished marble floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Manhattan skyline, glowing against the night sky. Venture capital firms, Wall Street executives, media personalities, industry leaders. Nearly every powerful person Charles needed in order to secure the biggest deal of his career sat somewhere inside that room. Phones quietly appeared beneath tables. Tiny camera lenses pointed toward the confrontation. Nobody announced they were recording. They didn't need to. The internet had trained people to recognize history before it happened. Charles adjusted the cuff of his jacket and glanced down at the sleeve. A few drops of sparkling water clung to the expensive fabric, barely visible, hardly important. Yet the annoyance on his face suggested something far larger had occurred. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" he asked loudly. The room remained silent. Naomi said nothing. Charles shook his head with a short laugh. The kind of laugh people use when they expect others to join them. A few nervous smiles appeared. Most stayed quiet, because something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not explosive, just wrong. The kind of feeling that settles into a room before everything changes. What nobody realized was that this story wasn't about a stained sleeve. It wasn't about a waitress. It wasn't even about a billionaire. It was about value. About how often people confuse wealth with worth. About how quickly arrogance can blind someone to the most important person in the room. Because while Charles Whitmore saw a server carrying trays, the truth sitting quietly behind Naomi Brooks was far more dangerous than any competitor, any lawsuit, or any market crash. And in less than 45 minutes, every person inside that ballroom would discover exactly who she was. But for now, Charles believed he was still the most powerful person in the building. He believed the cameras were pointed at her mistake. He believed the night belonged to him. He had no idea that his empire was already standing at the edge of a cliff. And with a single sentence, he had just taken the first step forward. 45 minutes earlier, the ballroom had looked less like a business event and more like a kingdom built from glass, gold, and confidence. Waiters moved quietly between tables. Investors exchanged handshakes worth millions. The city lights beyond the towering windows stretched across Manhattan like a sea of diamonds. Everything felt certain. Everything felt controlled. At the center of it all stood Charles Whitmore. People gravitated toward him naturally. Some wanted partnerships. Some wanted access. Others simply wanted to stand close enough to success to feel a piece of it themselves. Charles carried that kind of gravity. Every laugh he offered seemed calculated. Every compliment seemed strategic. Every conversation pointed toward the same destination. The acquisition. $3.5 billion. The largest transaction in Whitmore Technologies history. Across the ballroom, giant digital displays cycled through projections, growth charts, and market forecasts. Analysts praised the numbers. Financial reporters prepared headlines. Investors nodded as they studied presentation packets placed neatly at each seat. To most people in the room, the deal already felt finished. The signatures simply had not happened yet. Naomi Brooks noticed something different. She always did. While guests focused on status, she focused on details. While executives watched people, she watched patterns. It was a habit she had developed years earlier, long before she ever carried a serving tray. As she moved between tables collecting empty glasses, her eyes drifted across the financial materials resting near one of the investor groups. She was not trying to read them. She was simply passing by. But numbers have a way of catching the attention of people who understand them. One page remained partially exposed beneath a leather folder. A valuation chart. A projected revenue curve. A series of percentages. Naomi glanced once. Then again. Something felt strange. Not wrong exactly. Just unusual. The feeling stayed with her as she continued working. Nearby, investors discussed market expansion, artificial intelligence, international licensing, future earnings. The language was familiar, more familiar than anyone in the room would have guessed. Nobody asked questions when they saw Naomi carrying a tray. Nobody wondered what books she read. Nobody wondered why she often arrived early and left late. They saw a uniform and built a story around it. Most people do. That was one lesson life had taught her repeatedly. A group of guests laughed near the bar. One executive praised Charles for predicting industry trends years ahead of competitors. Another called him visionary. A third described him as unstoppable. Charles accepted every compliment with practiced ease. Confidence surrounded him like expensive cologne. Yet beneath the celebration, pressure quietly moved through the room. Not everyone was convinced. Several institutional investors remained cautious. A few board members wanted additional verification. A private equity representative had already requested supporting documents twice. The concerns were small, manageable, easy to overlook, but they existed. And in transactions worth billions, small concerns rarely stay small for long. Naomi passed near the presentation stage again. The giant screen displayed another series of projected earnings. Her eyes settled briefly on one percentage. Then another. Her pace slowed for half a second. The same uneasy feeling returned. Not because she knew what the problem was. Not yet. Only because something seemed slightly out of place. Like a single piano note drifting off key inside a perfect concert. She continued walking. Across the room, Charles raised a champagne glass and smiled for another photograph. Flashbulbs illuminated the ballroom. Applause followed. More laughter. More confidence. More certainty. The night appeared flawless. But sometimes the most dangerous cracks are the ones nobody sees until the foundation begins to shift. And somewhere beneath the celebration, hidden behind polished presentations and billion-dollar promises, a single detail waited quietly for someone to notice it. The strange feeling refused to leave Naomi alone. She collected empty glasses from a corner table, offered a polite smile to a guest, and continued moving through the ballroom. But her mind kept returning to the numbers she had glimpsed on the presentation materials. Most people believed details were boring. Naomi believed details told the truth. They always had. Long before she worked at the Grand Meridian Hotel, numbers had been the language she trusted most. Few people in that room would have guessed it. They saw a 27-year-old black waitress balancing trays and navigating crowded aisles. They did not see the late nights. They did not see the textbooks stacked beside her apartment window. They did not see the years spent studying financial analysis after exhausting shifts. They certainly did not know that Naomi Brooks had once dreamed of sitting at tables like these instead of serving them. 3 years earlier, she had graduated near the top of her business program. Professors praised her work ethic. Recruiters complimented her intelligence. Interviews came quickly. Job offers did not. Again and again, she found herself hearing polished versions of the same answer. We selected another candidate. We decided to move in a different direction. We are looking for someone who is a better fit. The words changed. The outcome never did. Bills arrived whether opportunities did or not. Her mother needed support. Rent increased. Life moved forward. So Naomi adapted. She took evening classes. Worked double shifts. Learned not to measure her worth by the assumptions of strangers. Yet she never stopped learning. Every spare moment became an investment. Financial reports. Market analyses. Corporate filings. While some people watched television before bed, Naomi studied industries. She studied acquisitions. She studied valuation models. She studied the exact kind of deal everyone celebrated tonight. Across the ballroom, another round of applause erupted. Charles had stepped onto the stage. Confidence seemed to follow him wherever he went. The giant screens behind him illuminated graphs and projections in shades of blue and gold. Guests focused on his words. Naomi found herself focusing on the slides. Revenue growth, market expansion, forecast adjustments. One chart disappeared. Another appeared. Then another. The uneasy feeling returned immediately, this time stronger. She slowed near the edge of the room. Something about the projections did not align. Not obviously. Not enough to attract attention, but enough to bother someone trained to notice patterns. Naomi glanced toward a nearby table where several investment representatives reviewed printed packets. One page remained visible. The same percentage appeared again. The same assumption. The same forecast. Her pulse quickened slightly. Not because she understood the entire problem. Not yet. But because she recognized the possibility of one. Meanwhile, the audience remained captivated. Charles moved through the presentation effortlessly. He spoke about innovation, leadership, future growth. The room rewarded each point with approving nods. Every answer sounded polished. Every prediction sounded certain. Yet certainty can be dangerous, especially in rooms filled with money. Naomi knew that from experience. The people who made the biggest mistakes were rarely the people who lacked intelligence. They were the people who stopped questioning themselves. Near the stage, several reporters prepared notes for tomorrow's headlines. Investors exchanged optimistic smiles. Champagne glasses clinked softly. The atmosphere felt victorious. But beneath the confidence, Naomi sensed tension building where nobody else seemed to notice it. Like distant thunder beyond a clear horizon. She looked again toward the presentation screen. Another figure appeared. Another projection. Another number that seemed just slightly too perfect. Her eyes narrowed. The puzzle pieces were not connected yet. The answer remained hidden. But for the first time that evening, Naomi became certain of one thing. The flaw she sensed was real. Somewhere inside the mountain of data supporting the largest deal in company history, something did not belong. And if she was right, the celebration unfolding around her was standing on much weaker ground than anyone realized. If there was one thing Charles Whitmore believed more than anything else, it was that success proved character. The higher he climbed, the more certain he became. In his mind, winners made good decisions. Winners deserved influence. Winners deserved respect. And by every visible measure, Charles was winning. He had built Whitmore Technologies from a small startup into one of the fastest-growing firms in America. Business magazines placed him on their covers. Financial networks invited him to predict market trends. Young entrepreneurs quoted his interviews as if they were scripture. Wherever Charles went, admiration followed. At least that was how it looked from the outside. Inside the company, the reality was more complicated. Employees respected his intelligence, but few felt comfortable around him. Meetings often felt like competitions rather than conversations. Questions were interpreted as challenges. Mistakes became lessons delivered in front of entire teams. Charles did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as efficient. To him, emotion slowed progress. Patience wasted time. Success belonged to people willing to demand excellence from everyone around them. Over the years, that mindset earned him billions of dollars. It also built walls he could no longer see. Tonight, those walls surrounded him completely. Near the stage, executives laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny. Investors nodded before he finished speaking. Staff members stepped aside the moment he approached. The room adjusted itself around his presence. Charles had become accustomed to that reaction. Eventually, he stopped noticing it. The dangerous thing about privilege is not that it changes how others see you. It changes how you see everyone else. As another presentation slide appeared behind him, Charles confidently moved through his prepared remarks. Market share projections, expansion strategies, long-term growth opportunities. Every sentence landed exactly where it was designed to. The audience responded with approval. Yet even while speaking, Charles remained focused on the outcome waiting ahead. The acquisition would cement his legacy. Analysts were already calling it transformative. Investors described it as visionary. The board expected celebration. Charles expected victory. Failure simply did not exist in his plans. A few feet away, Naomi continued working quietly among the tables. Charles never noticed her. Not really. To him, servers blended into the background. They appeared when needed and disappeared when finished. He knew the names of billionaires, founders, politicians, and celebrities. He did not know the names of people carrying trays. That distinction seemed normal to him. Natural, even. The irony, of course, was that Charles spent his entire career talking about innovation, about discovering hidden opportunities, about seeing value where others saw nothing. Yet tonight, the one person he consistently overlooked happened to possess exactly the kind of insight he claimed to admire. Not because she was wealthy, not because she was powerful, because she paid attention. While Charles focused on controlling the room, Naomi focused on understanding it. And understanding often beats control. The presentation continued. Applause followed another announcement. Investors exchanged optimistic glances. Everything appeared to be moving according to plan. Yet beneath the polished confidence, small signs of strain had begun to emerge. One investor reviewed the packet again. Another quietly compared figures on two separate pages. A third leaned toward a colleague and whispered something while pointing at a chart. The moments were brief. Easy to miss. Charles missed them completely. His attention remained fixed on the finish line. He could already imagine tomorrow's headlines. He could already picture interviews, celebrations, and congratulations. The deal felt inevitable. That certainty filled him with confidence. It also made him vulnerable, because certainty has a habit of silencing caution. And while Charles stood at the center of the spotlight believing he controlled the future was already beginning to move in a very different direction. The first real crack appeared so quietly that almost nobody noticed it. Almost. Naomi was carrying a tray of sparkling water toward a table near the front when she overheard two investors speaking in lowered voices. They were not criticizing the deal. Not yet. They were asking questions. Serious questions. One man tapped a page inside the presentation packet. Another frowned and adjusted his glasses. Naomi could not hear every word, but she caught enough. Revenue assumptions. Licensing projections. Overseas expansion figures. The same numbers that had been bothering her for the past 20 minutes. She continued walking, careful not to attract attention, but her mind was moving much faster than her feet. Something about the forecasts felt inflated. Not dramatically, not enough for an average observer to notice, but enough to create a dangerous chain reaction if the assumptions proved inaccurate. Across the ballroom, Charles remained completely at ease. His confidence seemed stronger with every passing minute. Guests lined up to congratulate him. Executives shook his hand. Reporters requested interviews for after the signing ceremony. Success surrounded him from every direction. The atmosphere felt almost celebratory. Yet beneath the polished smiles, questions continued spreading quietly through the room. An analyst flipped back and forth between two pages. A private equity representative opened a laptop and began checking figures independently. Another investor whispered something to a colleague while pointing toward one of the valuation charts. Small moments. Tiny signals. Easy to dismiss. But Naomi recognized them immediately. She had seen the same behavior countless times during case studies and business simulations. This was what happened when intelligent people sensed inconsistency. They started verifying. Near the stage, a large screen displayed another projection. Charles highlighted projected growth over the next 5 years. The numbers drew applause. Naomi stared at the chart. Then she froze. There it was. Not the entire problem. Just part of it. A percentage used in one forecast appeared inconsistent with a figure shown earlier. The difference was subtle. Most people would never notice. But once she saw it, she could not unsee it. Her heartbeat quickened. She moved toward the service station, set down her tray, and glanced back at the screen. The figures remained visible. She mentally compared them against the packet she had briefly seen earlier. Something was definitely wrong. The realization sent a chill through her. Not because she wanted the deal to fail. Quite the opposite. She understood what a transaction of this size meant. Jobs, investments, careers. Entire companies could be affected by decisions made tonight. That was exactly why accuracy mattered. Across the ballroom, Charles finished another section of the presentation and accepted another round of applause. The spotlight reflected from the polished stage floor. Cameras followed his movements. He looked every bit like a man in complete control of his future. Yet the closer the evening moved toward the final signing, the more fragile that image became. Naomi noticed something else. Several investors were no longer looking at Charles. They were looking at the documents. That shift mattered. People listen with emotion, but they invest with evidence. And evidence has a way of exposing weaknesses that confidence cannot hide. The tension remained invisible to most guests. Laughter still echoed through the ballroom. Servers continued moving between tables. Music drifted softly through the air. On the surface, nothing had changed. Beneath the surface, everything was beginning to change. Naomi took a slow breath and looked toward the stage one more time. For the first time all evening, she became certain that the issue was not in her imagination. There was a flaw somewhere inside the numbers. A flaw serious enough to make experienced investors hesitate. And if nobody identified it before the signing ceremony, the consequences could be enormous. The countdown toward that discovery had already begun. The moment arrived through something so small that nobody should have remembered it. Naomi was clearing glasses near the head table when one of the investors accidentally nudged a glass of sparkling water. A few drops splashed across the edge of Charles Whitmore's sleeve. Barely noticeable. Harmless. The kind of thing most people would laugh off and forget within seconds. Charles did not laugh. He looked down at the tiny drops, as if they represented a personal insult. The conversation around the table faded. Several guests turned toward him. Naomi immediately reached for a clean linen cloth. "I am sorry, sir. Let me help with that," she said calmly. The words had barely left her mouth before Charles stepped back. His expression hardened. The easy confidence he had displayed all evening suddenly shifted into irritation. "Do not touch me," he said sharply. Nearby conversation stopped. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Naomi lowered the cloth. "Of course, sir," she replied. The situation could have ended there. It should have ended there. Instead, Charles continued. Perhaps it was the pressure of the evening. Perhaps it was the confidence that comes from believing you cannot fail. Or perhaps it was simply habit. Whatever the reason, he chose the worst possible moment to say exactly what he was thinking. "Honestly, this is why details matter," he said loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. A simple task should not be that difficult. The room grew quieter. Naomi remained composed. She had heard similar comments before. Different words. Same message. Yet something about tonight felt different. Charles looked around the table as if expecting agreement. A few nervous smiles appeared. Most people stayed silent. Then he laughed lightly and shook his head. "Some people just are not built for complex work," he said. His eyes landed directly on Naomi. "That is probably why they end up carrying trays instead of making decisions." The sentence landed heavily. Not because it was shouted, because it was deliberate. The silence that followed felt thicker than the music drifting through the ballroom. Naomi stood perfectly still. Across the room, several guests looked away. Others stared into their drinks. A reporter quietly lowered a notebook and listened. One investor frowned. Another shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Charles noticed none of it. He mistook silence for approval. "You know what the real problem is?" he continued. "People make mistakes, then act surprised when nobody trusts them with responsibility." He gestured casually toward the cloth still resting in Naomi's hand. "Maybe focus on the basics before worrying about anything more complicated." The words hung in the air. Naomi felt every eye in the room turning toward her. Yet she refused to give Charles the reaction he expected. No anger. No argument. No embarrassment. Just calm. That calm unsettled people more than any response could have. Because while Charles believed he was demonstrating authority, everyone else was beginning to witness something else entirely. Arrogance. And arrogance has a way of revealing itself most clearly when it meets dignity. Naomi quietly placed the cloth back onto her tray. Then she glanced toward the presentation screen across the ballroom. The same numbers remained there. The same inconsistency. The same flaw nobody had addressed. For a brief moment, she considered walking away, remaining silent, letting the evening unfold without her involvement. After all, nobody had asked for her opinion. Nobody expected her to have one. But as she looked around the room, she realized something important. The people preparing to sign this deal deserved the truth, whether they knew it or not. And somewhere behind Charles's confidence, hidden beneath billions of dollars and years of success, a mistake was waiting to be exposed. For several seconds, Naomi said nothing. The ballroom remained suspended in an uncomfortable silence. Charles appeared satisfied. He had delivered his judgment. The room had heard it. In his mind, the moment was over. Then Naomi looked toward the stage. Her eyes settled on the giant screen displaying the financial projections. A quiet thought became a decision. She set her tray down carefully and spoke for the first time. "Sir, may I ask a question about the presentation?" The request caught everyone off guard. Several guests blinked in surprise. A few reporters immediately paid closer attention. Charles let out a short laugh. "A question," he said, "about a multi-billion-dollar acquisition." A few nervous chuckles echoed around the table. Naomi remained calm. "Yes, sir." Charles folded his arms. "This should be interesting." The tone drew more attention than the words. Investors nearby turned in their seats. Executives paused their conversations. Even people across the ballroom sensed something unusual unfolding. Naomi looked at the screen again. The projected international licensing growth rate shown on slide 22 does not match the assumptions used in the valuation model. The room froze. Charles stared at her. Several investors immediately looked back toward the screen. One analyst opened the presentation packet. Another adjusted his glasses and began flipping pages. Charles smiled dismissively. "That is not possible." Naomi nodded slightly. "I thought the same thing at first." The confidence in her voice felt strange coming from someone everyone had spent the evening overlooking. She continued, "But the growth rate shown in the forecast appears to be significantly higher than the figure used in the supporting market data." The silence deepened. Pages began turning. Laptop screens opened. Investors stopped watching Charles and started checking numbers. The shift was subtle, but it changed everything. Charles noticed it immediately. For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed his face. "You are misunderstanding the data," he said. Naomi did not react. "Perhaps, but if I am wrong, the numbers should reconcile." A senior investment partner near the front table raised a hand. "Bring up slide 22. The giant screen changed. Charts appeared. Percentages filled the display. Several analysts compared the information against printed packets. One frowned, then another. A third investor leaned forward in his chair. Nobody was laughing anymore. The room had become a courtroom, and the evidence was speaking for itself. Charles turned toward his chief financial officer. The executive quickly began reviewing documents. His confidence disappeared faster than anyone expected. Naomi remained silent now. She had said enough. The numbers were doing the rest. 30 seconds passed. Then 60. The longest 60 seconds of Charles Whitmore's career. Finally, one of the analysts looked up from his calculations. "She is right." The words landed harder than any accusation. A second analyst reached the same conclusion. Then a third. The inconsistency was real. The projected valuation relied on assumptions that could not be supported by the underlying data. Not a simple typo. Not a formatting error. A material discrepancy. Across the ballroom, expressions changed one by one. Admiration became confusion. Confusion became concern. Charles looked toward Naomi. For the first time that evening, he was not looking at a waitress. He was looking at the person who had seen what his entire executive team had missed. And suddenly the room understood something Charles had failed to understand from the beginning. The most important voice in the building had never been standing on the stage. The atmosphere inside the ballroom changed with startling speed. 1 minute, the room had been celebrating a historic acquisition. The next, it was investigating whether the foundation of that acquisition could be trusted at all. Analysts moved quickly. Laptops opened across multiple tables. Financial models were rechecked. Assumptions were questioned. Every number that had looked impressive an hour earlier suddenly demanded proof. Charles Whitmore stood near the stage, watching control slip away one calculation at a time. His chief financial officer spoke quietly with members of the due diligence team. Their expressions revealed everything before a single word was spoken. Concern, uncertainty, alarm. The confidence that had filled the room all evening was evaporating. Naomi remained near the edge of the ballroom. She did not celebrate. She did not seek attention. She simply watched as professionals did what professionals were supposed to do. Verify the facts. One senior investor requested an immediate review of the supporting documents. Another suspended the scheduled signing until all discrepancies could be explained. The decision sent a ripple through the room. Conversations grew sharper. Reporters exchanged looks. Phones vibrated. News traveled fast when billions of dollars were involved. 10 minutes later, the review produced even more questions. The original inconsistency had not created the problem. It had exposed it. Several projections relied on assumptions that could not be independently verified. Growth estimates appeared more optimistic than the underlying market reports justified. Risk factors had been minimized. Individually, none of the issues seemed catastrophic. Together, they painted a very different picture than the one investors had been shown. The lead representative from the investment consortium finally stood. The room fell silent. Everyone knew the announcement would determine the future of the deal. He adjusted his glasses, glanced toward his colleagues, and spoke carefully. Given the unresolved concerns identified during this review, we are unable to proceed with the transaction at this time. The words landed like a door closing. No shouting followed. No dramatic reactions. Just silence. Heavy silence. The kind that arrives when reality replaces expectation. Around the ballroom, faces changed. Executives who had been smiling minutes earlier stared at the floor. Reporters immediately began typing. Investors gathered documents and exchanged private comments. Years of planning had collided with a few minutes of scrutiny. Charles looked toward the stage where the signing ceremony was supposed to happen. The pens remained untouched. The agreement remained unsigned. The acquisition that had seemed inevitable no longer existed. $3.5 billion vanished, not because of one waitress. Not because of one comment. Not even because of one mistake. It vanished because confidence had been treated as a substitute for accuracy. Nearby, a financial journalist quietly asked another reporter, "Who found the discrepancy?" Several people turned toward Naomi. For the second time that night, the room became still. Only now the attention felt completely different. Nobody saw a server carrying a tray anymore. They saw the person whose observation had prevented them from moving forward without answers. Charles followed their gaze. His eyes settled on Naomi, the same woman he had dismissed, the same woman he had underestimated, and standing there beneath the glow of the ballroom lights, with investors, executives, and reporters all looking in her direction, Naomi Brooks had become the one person in the room whose judgment everyone suddenly respected. The ballroom slowly emptied, but the weight of what had happened remained behind. Conversations that had once revolved around growth, profits, and celebration now centered on one question. How had everyone missed it? Investors gathered their documents and headed toward private meetings. Reporters filed updates before reaching the elevators. Executives stood in small groups, replaying the evening in their minds. Yet through all of it, Naomi Brooks remained exactly who she had been when the night began. She picked up her tray. She collected abandoned glasses. She continued doing her job. That simple fact seemed to confuse people the most. Several investors approached her before leaving. One thanked her personally. Another asked about her background. A third handed her a business card and told her to call if she ever wanted a different career. Naomi accepted each gesture politely. Nothing more. She was not looking for recognition. She had spoken because the truth mattered, not because attention did. Across the room, Charles Whitmore stood alone near the stage. For the first time all evening, nobody was surrounding him. No reporters. No congratulatory handshakes. No eager executives seeking approval. The spotlight that had followed him for years suddenly felt much colder. He watched Naomi from a distance as she cleared a nearby table. Then he did something nobody expected. He walked toward her. The room seemed to notice immediately. Conversations softened. A few people paused on their way out. Charles stopped several feet away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt different now. Earlier it had been filled with arrogance. Now it carried reflection. Finally, Charles took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words were simple, honest. There was no audience left to impress. No deal left to save. Only the truth. Naomi looked at him calmly. Charles lowered his eyes briefly. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. And tonight that mistake cost more than money." Naomi studied him for a moment. The room remained quiet. Then she nodded. Not because the apology erased what had happened. Because acknowledging the truth was where change began. Charles glanced toward the dark presentation screen. Hours earlier he had believed success made him important. Tonight had taught him something different. Success could open doors. It could build companies. It could create wealth. But it could never replace character. "Why did you help?" he asked quietly. "After the way I treated you?" Naomi smiled faintly. "Because the numbers were wrong." Charles gave a short laugh despite himself. Naomi continued. "And because everyone in this room deserved the truth." The answer stayed with him. No anger. No revenge. No attempt to embarrass him. Just principle. Just integrity. The very qualities he claimed to value, yet had failed to recognize standing directly in front of him. As the final guests disappeared into the Manhattan night, Naomi gathered her things and prepared to leave. One of the investors called after her and reminded her about the business card. Another wished her luck. She thanked them and headed toward the exit. Before she reached the doors, she turned back once. Charles was still standing near the stage, staring at the empty room where certainty had collapsed and perspective had arrived. Then Naomi walked away. Not richer, not famous, not transformed into someone new. She did not need to be. Her value had never depended on the opinion of a billionaire. And that was the lesson hidden inside the entire night. Wealth can command attention. Power can fill a room. Titles can impress strangers. But respect is earned differently. It begins with seeing people clearly. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person who sees the truth first. And sometimes the most expensive mistake a person can make is believing that dignity comes with a price tag. Charles had the money. Naomi had the truth. And in the end, truth proved far more valuable than $3.5 billion.